Well, good evening and welcome to Whither Criticism, a series of discussions about architectural criticism. This 6-episode series is sponsored by the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab and funded by the Office of the Provost at Florida International University. I'm David Rifkind, a faculty member in the Department of Architecture.
And I'm Dan Evans, a faculty member in the Department of Journalism and Media and the Miami Bureau Chief for the South Florida Media Network. We've asked 6 current and former architecture critics to discuss the current state of the field and to offer their thoughts on how architecture criticism needs to adjust to respond to the major crises in our time. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Inga Saffron. Ms. Saffron has been the architecture critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer since 1999. Her writing has been recognized with numerous awards, including the 2018 Vincent Scully Prize from the National Building Museum, the 2010 Jean Bird Award for Excellence in Urban Journalism, and most significantly, the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Criticism. The Pulitzer Committee cited her for her criticism of architecture that blends expertise, civic passion, and sheer readability into arguments that consistently stimulate and surprise. This summer, Rutgers University Press published a collection of her essays in a book, Becoming Philadelphia: How an Old American City Made Itself New Again. Welcome, Inga. Sorry.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, David and Daniel, for organizing this series at this moment in the political life of our country. It's nice to be able to talk about a subject that gets far too little attention in the national discourse, yet is fundamental to our democracy, and that's how we shape our built environment. My name is Inga Saffron, and as you said, I became the full-time architecture critic at the Philadelphia Inquirer 20 years ago. The profession has changed quite a bit in that time, and the events of the last few months are sure to accelerate its evolution. But before I get to the whither part of this talk, I want to spend a little time talking about the what. What is criticism? There's no single way to be a critic, no written job description, as far as I know. Actually, there aren't all that many people who identify as architecture critics. I doubt there are a dozen journalists in the US who write about architecture argumentatively for general interest publications and websites. Most of us who identify as critics are not trained architects. We don't have degrees in architectural history. We are merely ordinary people who are hypersensitive to our physical surroundings, who hold strong opinions about how those places ought to be constructed, and somehow got hold of a soapbox that allows us to express our views. Before I became the Inquirer's architecture critic, I was just a regular old news reporter. I spent years covering suburban town meetings, planning commissions, school board meetings. For a while, I was even responsible for covering the county sewer authority. That really stunk. And after that, I went overseas as a foreign correspondent and covered 2 wars. The municipal experience taught me 2 things: how to navigate government bureaucracy, a skill that comes in handy when developers don't want to share their plans with you. And second, never underestimate the role of politics and money in determining what gets built. My time overseas taught me that wars and their destruction aren't just about controlling territory, they're also about controlling the past. All of these experiences were preparation for writing about architecture. There are some critics who take the big picture view of architectural trends, mainly those who work for national publications, but that's not me. I'm a local critic, and while I always try to situate what I'm writing in the larger context, my primary subject is Philadelphia and its suburbs. My job is to chronicle the city's evolving form, to advocate for good design and planning, and to hold architects, developers, and public officials accountable. I've always felt that the title architecture critic was really an inadequate description for what I do, and I've struggled to come up with a better one. A few of my colleagues call themselves built environment critics. Once somebody called me a city critic, which I sort of like. But because I combine criticism with traditional reporting techniques, I sometimes think of myself as an investigative critic. I practice a form of accountability journalism that happens to be design focused. From the beginning, I've interpreted my responsibilities in the broadest possible way. I write about anything that affects the form of the city: planning, land use, public space, historic preservation, transit, housing, as well as architectural design. It's become common for people interested in this particular bundle of issues to refer to themselves as urbanists. And while the contingent of actual architecture critics has been shrinking, the number of urbanist critics has actually grown significantly in recent years, as have popular urbanist websites like Curb, City Lab, Next City, Streets Blog, and all the many YIMBY sites. What differentiates my work from real estate writers or transportation reporters and people who write about gentrification is that design is always my starting point. I'm extremely fortunate that my tenure in this job has coincided with a period of extreme transformation in Philadelphia, a really epochal moment that has provided no end of good column topics. The extent of the changes really hit home for me when I was selecting the pieces for this just published collection of my work, Becoming Philadelphia. The title is a reference to the city's comeback over the last 2 decades as it has reasserted itself. But it's also about my own journey. I'm a native New Yorker, I should say ex-New Yorker, who has embraced the city and its culture. Many of you have probably heard Winston Churchill's oft-quoted observation about architecture. First we shape our buildings, then our buildings shape us. You can apply the same formulation to architecture criticism. For me, it's the place that shapes the critic. I'd be a very different kind of critic if I were writing in a moneyed city like New York or a more design-conscious city like Miami or LA. Recently, I served on an awards jury for the AIA in Dallas, and I was really struck by how many of the projects were discrete, standalone buildings. In Philadelphia, we mostly live in row houses. It's a place where every building is connected to every other building, and that makes other people's business your business. It's a very old and historic city with astonishing collections of buildings from the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Ben Franklin would still recognize the place, and so would the architect Louis Kahn. My work is influenced by the fact that I write for a general interest local newspaper, one of the few mass market institutions that still survives in a world of niches and bubbles. My readers know nothing about the sort of professional issues that excite architects. They have no understanding of how buildings and public spaces come into being. They may never think in terms of design, yet that doesn't make them any less invested in their surroundings. In fact, they're passionate about every change that occurs in their communities, whether they understand the role that design plays or not. All that makes being a critic in Philadelphia a very intimate experience. Philadelphia is a city of 1.5 million people in a metro area of 6 million, yet I always jokingly say that it's America's biggest small town. And I write about locally produced architecture usually, which means I'm interviewing and critiquing local architects, developers, politicians. And these are people I will invariably interact with again and again. And it's easy to trash someone like Norman Foster, who designed this building, which is the tallest building in Philadelphia, the Comcast Technology Center, because, you know, maybe I spent all of 5 minutes with him and I will never see him again. But it's a bit more daunting to write a negative column about people you're likely to run into on the street or at a party. We used to run into each other at parties. My first loyalty, though, is to my readers, and I consider it a badge of honor that there are a few people who no longer speak to me. So Okay, back to the what. Well, this has been a very strange year. I want to show you a few of my recent columns to give you a sense of how wide-ranging criticism is right now. Since the end of 2019, I have written only 2 columns that could be described as a traditional architecture review of a single building. And I wanted to show you this one, this column, which looks at plans for a major development next to the city's Catholic cathedral. It's a good example of how a review can be both local and global at the same time. The project that I was writing about, it's planned for a well-known local site, a cherished place for most Philadelphians, right in the center of the city. And like many of my reviews of unbuilt projects, this column focused on the process. The main complaint I made in the column is that the city was looking at a multi-building project in a kind of piecemeal fashion. Instead of having the developer show the designs for all the towers at the same time, they only showed one tower. And so I wrote a column about that. But even while I was talking about the problems with the process, my review engaged the larger architectural concerns about the ubiquity of tinted blue glass towers, what I call the color of global capital. And I talk about the economic reasons that glass has become so popular, the material of choice. And I talk also about how its effect on bird populations, which is quite serious here. But these days, most of my columns are not about specific building designs. In the months before COVID, I wrote 2 columns about parking and traffic calming, including pieces about city officials who park illegally in the median of Philadelphia's elegant Benjamin Franklin Parkway. I wrote 3 columns about how technology is reconfiguring the city's form. This one was an end of the decade look back at the impact of the smartphone on urban design. I wrote another column about how the delivery economy is effectively turning supermarkets and stores into urban warehouses with serious implications for the pedestrian experience. Rather than focusing on a single building, these columns explored how larger global forces are playing out in our local environment. Because buildings are a product of existing social structures, it's increasingly difficult to write about them without also acknowledging and exploring those structures. In this piece, I looked at the methods that Philadelphia's mostly white trade unions have used to monopolize construction jobs and keep people of color from participating in the recent building boom. It's not the first time that I've addressed this aspect of construction. It's been a big racial justice issue in Philadelphia for years. But this is common. I'll often return to the same topic as a way of elaborating on or advancing a theme. And this column gave me an opportunity to talk about efforts to open up construction jobs to people in minority communities. So architecture is often a 3D expression of our national policy debates. And this building was the subject of a column about an architect developer who was trying to address climate change by designing a building entirely clad in solar panels. I think I called it a cross between a D-volt battery and the Death Star. Even the architect's own son said the building was incredibly ugly. And if I were merely concerned about aesthetics, I might have agreed. But a design like this really challenges you to rethink your criteria for evaluating buildings. When whole swaths of our country are burning and being torn up by hurricanes, what are we willing to sacrifice in terms of looks and comfort? All of these columns that I just showed you were written before March, when the pandemic shifted the conversation. And since then, the big story for architecture and urbanist writers has been how COVID will alter the way we live. I'm sure you've seen the dozens of stories about how people are fleeing cities for the suburbs and the dozens of other stories about how they're not fleeing the cities for the suburbs. I do not believe this is the end of cities, but I do think they face extreme challenges. And I've written a series of pieces about the impact of the pandemic on offices, on stores, parks, street life, and how all those things all those places that we've, become accustomed to are being reconfigured by this new reality. And of course, several recent columns have also responded to the issues raised by Black Lives Matter. At the height of the protests, I learned that Philadelphia officials were pushing through a new $20 million police station in the city's poorest neighborhood. That column was the first time that most Philadelphians had heard about the project. And there was a huge public outcry after my column appeared. And without claiming all the credit, I do believe that my assessment played a role in the project being voted down. So that's this year, which is not a typical year. But I thought this eclectic list of stories would help demonstrate just the range of what architecture criticism is at this very moment. It wasn't always like this. And for a long time, critics behaved more like architecture historians. They mostly wrote about individual buildings and designs with a strong focus on their formal qualities. I belong to what I think of as a third generation of architecture critics. The first generation included luminaries like Ada Louise Huxtable, Louis Mumford, Aline Saarinen. They were, sometimes style warriors, champions of modernism and the international style. That doesn't mean they never took on social or development issues, but their reviews tended to focus on high-profile public buildings. And later critics like Paul Goldberger might have been less pure on the style issues, but they also stuck to writing about buildings, particularly large public buildings, corporate offices, museums. There wasn't all that much writing about neighborhood development. But the seeds of dissent had already been planted. There was probably no greater challenge to the conventions of criticism than Jane Jacobs' landmark book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961. Note she also wears those little round architecture glasses. Her book, which is still very much worth reading, is a searing critique of modernist planning ideas, which led to the clear cutting of old neighborhoods for urban renewal projects and highways. And along with William C. White, she redirected the discussion from critiques of individual buildings to deep analysis of policies and practices that shape communities, something we might today call placemaking. It's no accident that we begin to see the rise of postmodernism shortly afterward, after Jacobs' book appeared, with buildings like Robert Venturi's Guild House in Philadelphia. And I can see how it might not look all that special today, but it defied the conventions of its time. The fact that the front doors open onto the sidewalk, that it used the same materials as its neighbors and incorporated some abstracted classical elements were quite a big deal. And this is Venturi wearing much more traditional glasses. Most of this conversation occurred before my time, but like many people of my generation, I would absorb the ideas of Jacobs, White, and Venturi almost by osmosis. I was deeply influenced by Jacobs' contention that cities would, quote, unslum organically if neighborhoods were allowed to remain intact, and if all new development was designed to be pedestrian friendly. Jacobs wasn't just interested in the form of individual buildings, but also in the way their form affected our experience of place. The The lessons of Jane Jacobs really hit home for me after I got my first newspaper job, working for a small daily newspaper in central New Jersey. I was assigned to cover a small, economically depressed city called Plainfield. It's a suburb of New York. Plainfield had once been a really wealthy place. Its Victorian era homes were so beautiful that it was nicknamed the Queen City. And during its heyday, it boasted a compact downtown with department stores and movie theaters and rows of specialty shops. But in the 60s, lured by the promise of urban renewal money, the city leveled a massive chunk of its downtown. So it looked like this. That was in the late 60s, and I didn't arrive there as a reporter until 20 years later, at the end of the 80s. But that parking lot was still there. And I remember asking a city official, what happened to the downtown? And the official just shrugged and said, urban renewal. The demolition of the business district did nothing to slow the city's decline, and it probably accelerated it. I spent much of my time in Plainfield writing stories about efforts to redevelop and revive this area. And it was around that time that I realized that this is what I wanted to write about, how cities, shape their built environments, the mistakes they made, and the ways they could do it better. So it would take more than a decade before I got a chance to do this. I left this New Jersey paper for the Inquirer, and like all reporters, I dreamed of covering the big city. Instead, I was immediately sent back to the Jersey suburbs. And then life, took a strange detour. And just as I was despairing of ever escaping the suburbs, I got a chance to go overseas as a foreign correspondent. I had always had this strong interest in Eastern Europe, and I ended up covering the breakup of Yugoslavia and then the demise of the Soviet Union. In both places, I covered two very destructive wars. I was in Bosnia when Serbian forces began leveling these gracious century-old neighborhoods and bombing ancient mosques. American cities had ruined themselves with poorly thought out urban renewal projects. And these European cities ruined themselves with these tribal feuds. But the effects on cities were not all that different. History and the intricate web of human connections were destroyed. And it's no accident that people often describe blighted areas of American cities as looking bombed out. So all of this was on my mind when I started covering architecture in Philadelphia in 1999. Philadelphia hadn't destroyed itself during the urban renewal period quite as much as some other cities, but it had suffered decades of population and job loss. And that in turn left neighborhoods badly battered. Homes and factories were abandoned, and the longer they sat vacant, the more they crumbled and decayed. Hardly anything new was being built as late as 2000. Maybe the most shocking moment for me was seeing this burned office tower across from City Hall in the very center of Philadelphia's downtown. It had actually gone up in flames in 1991. At the time, it was the worst high-rise fire in America. That fire occurred just a couple months before I left for Yugoslavia to be a foreign correspondent. And unbelievably, the burned out building was still there when I returned to the city 7 years later. The building wasn't taken down for another year. And it was a painful reminder of just how far the city had fallen. Of course, many American cities had suffered similar declines, but many had begun to make a kind of comeback by the late 90s. And this was the era of the TV show Friends and Sex and the City, which were a big departure from the very dark crime dramas of the 70s and 80s. And they presented cities in this new, more positive light as places to have fun and fall in love. And it was, I think, kind of a watershed moment. In many ways, those shows mirrored what was happening in architecture. Only 2 years before I became the critic, Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum opened in Bilbao, and dozens of journalists flocked to the opening. The building became a sensation, not just for its architecture, but for its city building potential. And Bilbao, which was then a down at the heels industrial city in the Basque region of Spain, had bet that this dramatic work of architecture would help transform it into a tourist mecca. I don't think they had any idea of how influential it would be. The opening of the museum launched what became known as the Bilbao effect. And cities around the world became convinced that if they could come up with their own glamorous work of architecture, they could instantly leverage a downtown revival. So every time a signature building like this by a famous architect opened, packs of architecture journalists would descend to review and celebrate this latest showstopper. The fascination with the new and the innovative defined how the public saw architecture. Well, I admit I went on a couple of these trips, but it really felt beside the point to be writing about them for a city that was really still holding on for dear life. Nobody was building fantastically expensive luxury condos like this trio by Richard Meyer on the Greenwich Village waterfront. We didn't have that in Philadelphia. What they were doing still was tearing down solid downtown buildings and erecting parking garages and surface lots, just like the one I had seen in Plainfield. So rather than jetting around the world to write about isolated celebrity buildings, I felt I could be more useful writing about these self-destructive planning missteps and writing about and defending historic buildings that the city and developers were targeting for demolition. I can't tell you how many screeds I wrote in those early days against parking garages, or how many people told me that parking issues were not a worthy subject for an architecture critic. I wasn't just writing about garages, of course. I was trying to explain the impact of privileging the automobile, how privileging the automobile, the impact it was having on Philadelphia's greatest strengths, its human-scaled, walkable streets, and its fine neighborhoods. And like Jane Jacobs, I became obsessed with the form of these neighborhoods. I spent a lot of time crusading against these garage-fronted row houses and highways with blank walls at the street level. I advocated for historic preservation, for ground floor retail, for investments in public space, for wider sidewalks, better crosswalks, for bike lanes, transit improvements. Occasionally, someone in Philadelphia would produce a decent work of architecture and I would happily review it. But it wasn't common. And then at some point, something unexpected happened. The architecture in Philadelphia started to improve. Nothing like the Richard Meyer towers, but we started to see well-made apartment buildings and modern row house developments, and universities started expanding. New museums and concert halls went up. Neighborhoods were transformed overnight, and I could hardly keep up with the reviews. Then again, at a certain point, maybe as 2015 or 16, I got to the point where I felt I could not write one more review about a luxury apartment building. In many respects, Philadelphia had made this remarkable comeback. It stopped losing population and started gaining population. It was gaining jobs. Yet we were beginning to see something that had never occurred here, which was gentrification. Neighborhoods were being transformed into these glittering islands of wealth. And even as that happened, Philadelphia was earning the ignoble distinction of being the poorest big city in America. Over the last decade, we've gained 71,000 jobs, and yet somehow we've added 65,000 people more to the poverty rolls. Writing another column about the need for contextual development seemed like a little bit of an indulgence. The last few years, I've looked for ways to tell both of these stories, the story of a city resurgent and the story of a city still mired in poverty. If there is an important downtown development, I would certainly cover it. But if someone builds another luxury condo building, I don't think the world needs me to review it. I've been working harder to tell stories of overlooked neighborhoods. I recently wrote a column on this somewhat dangerous traffic intersection in this very, lively North Philadelphia neighborhood. And yes, that photo with that the graffiti did appear in the Inquirer. I was already writing about equity issues in the built environment before this summer's racial reckoning, but I feel critics are going to have to become more attuned to those issues, myself included. We need to focus more on the interplay between design and affordable housing, density and sustainability. And it won't be as easy as it sounds. And there are a lot of inconsistencies. For instance, Philadelphia needs more affordable housing, yet many low-income neighborhoods, like this one in the picture, are vehemently opposed to the density that makes that possible. People still want to live in suburban houses with yards, and for rich and poor alike, parking remains sacrosanct, no matter what Jane Jacobs says. So where do those contradictions leave criticism? I'd like to think that we can find a synthesis of form and advocacy, of equity, and writing about issues on the ground, writing about design. And so I think we have to write about it all in the future. So, that's my thoughts at the moment about where we might be going. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Inga. We wanted to remind our audience that they can submit questions via the Q&A feature on their Zoom screens. But first, I wanted to start by asking you about the other things that you bring into your criticism. I just read the last column that you wrote, which is part of that. You were just starting to talk about that relationship between population growth, but also the increase in the number of people living in poverty in the city. And in it, like in so much of your work, you talk about labor issues, about issues of racial segregation and equity and opportunity. And these have all been a part of your writing for a while, but I'm wondering, what do you do to invest your writing with that level of expertise? Like basically it seems like a lot for somebody who is also trying to, become an expert in writing about the built environment and all these other things. Like, how do you do that?
It's not easy. That article, which appeared the other day, was really, really outside the norm for me. And that has something to do with the pandemic. And I used to be on a very rigid column schedule. I was writing 6 columns a month. And since the pandemic started, that column was suspended, and now I write my column more regularly, and I've been drafted into various projects. So that story was part of a year-long series we're about to undertake on the future of work, and I was asked to write the opening essay. And you know, it's pretty far afield from a built environment story. It was about how Philadelphia became the poorest big city in America. So I had to spend a lot of time getting up to speed to write that one. That was a challenge for me. I mean, there's a little bit in there about construction. I do know about that, but you know, I had to really bone up on the city's history and interview a lot of people to get to the point where I could write that.
I'm sure, you know, just the amount of effort it must take in order to speak with authority about something. I mean, it's part of journalism, right? To parachute into different ideas and to learn as much as you can within the time you have for your deadline, right? But
Yeah.
well, I want to ask a slightly on a slightly different topic, but very much related. You know, because you've talking about how much the city has really reinvented itself over the last 20 years. How much of this do you think is, you know, attributed to an improvement in the skyline through these things, and how much is the social justice issues that allowed certain projects to be built, or the change in the politics, or others discarded? Like, for instance, was there any project that you can speak to that may have been a real boon for the city? I know you mentioned the police station in North Philly as one that may have been a huge detractor to the city, but is there one that you can think of that really helped really bring people together, or any of the, you know, the walkability issues, or I don't know, just that along those lines?
Yeah. So, you know, I think what happened to Philadelphia obviously was happening in many cities around the country, and that's why I mentioned those TV shows, because Friends and Sex and the City, because even though they took place in New York, they recast our idea of the city, and you know, I mean, there were always people who I mean, Philadelphia is very fortunate that it never completely emptied out. Its downtown never emptied out. But you know, there were people who were afraid to come in at night. I mean, you know, I think things started to change in the late 90s when you had, you know, people who had just graduated from college, who felt, you know, the suburbs were boring and they wanted to live in the city, and they'd seen these TV shows. And then the city, you know, the city did undertake some policies to make the city friendlier to people. You know, they began in the late 90s with all these attractions, you know, sort of on the Bilbao model, you know, Baltimore's aquarium, you know, trying to get suburbanites to come in to the city to go to a show, go to a restaurant. There was a huge emphasis on that. That actually prompted the construction of a lot of parking garages, because people were afraid to walk downtown. They wanted to park next to wherever they were going. And then this, I think one of the most effective things the city did was it adopted this 10-year property tax abatement. So if you bought a new house, you wouldn't pay property taxes for 10 years. And I thought it was kind of a gimmick, you know, like, are you really going to choose to live in the city because you're getting 10 years of free taxes? Well, apparently it really meant a lot to people. And housing construction started to take off. And so instead of, like, initially the city thought, you know, tourists would save it, but I really think it was all these people putting down roots and moving into the city. You could also get a tax abatement for renovating a house. And so we started to see all this infill construction, and, you know, more people, more density, more restaurants, more, you know, stuff going on, and I think it snowballed. I mean, there are obviously a lot of other things that happened, that you know, we did all the usual things of building stadiums and concert halls, and you know, but I think it was really sort of a change in the way people thought about this place, as well as a huge flux of immigrants. I think that was also something that was very powerful in the city.
It's very interesting. I was wondering too, because you've talked about how your columns have been received, especially by the general public, and how they've had an impact, especially in the case of the police station. I'm wondering too, because you do have these really strong relationships with the architecture community in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is an enormous small town, right? Where there's this kind of intimacy there. And I'm wondering, have you noticed, or has anybody told you about any changes in their architectural practices based on either your public columns or your private communication with them?
You know, people flatter you, of course. One of the things I didn't talk about was early on, I would write these columns complaining about like apartment towers that were built on garage podiums with no ground floor retail, and, you know, all these blank walls. And I was, you know, a real hobby horse of mine, you know, to talk about, you know, Jane Jacobs style, you know, activating the ground floor, and et cetera, et cetera. And over time, I would say that developers and architects, you know, have got religion in this regard. And, you know, it's been very satisfying for me to see designs now. I mean, they might not be great architecture, but the urbanism has really, really improved. I think, you know, the combination of developers and architects realize how important it is to integrate with the surroundings, and to encourage pedestrians, and that street life makes their building more attractive. So I don't think it was just me, but, you know, I did harp on that for a long, long time. And, you know, it's much better. I will say one of my happiest, proudest moments was when a developer built a downtown high-rise with no parking at all. It was the first, you know, sort of recent tower built in the city that had no parking. And of course, it didn't need parking because it was like right downtown, and we have a pretty good transit system.
That's fascinating. I know that's in Miami that would be a very hard sell, but it probably shouldn't be, just simply because that's just, you know, how you create a more walkable city is by forcing people out of their cars, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also wanted to ask about your process, you know, in terms of in your development as a writer, how you became, how you developed your style. Is there any advice that you can give from your own development to somebody that is a younger writer starting in the field, wanting to do more architecture criticism and not really knowing how or where to start? Any thoughts on your own personal development and how that might be transferred to somebody, the next generation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it helps to, you know, have a little, you know, do a little reading, and to read other critics, to sort of understand what the issues are. You know, of course, if you go on social media, everyone has opinions. You know, one of the things about having a reporting background, you know, I don't just write, you know, whatever comes out of my head. I almost always, you know, interview a lot of different people. And, you know, I don't always agree with them. I want to hear all the sides. And then, you know, when I sit down to write, I try to forget, you know, who said what and who argued what, and just, I try to figure out what do I think? And I think it's very important to have a point. And if I was writing, just ordinary, an ordinary newspaper story, we might call that the nut graph. And I do try to have nut graphs in my columns. They might not exactly look like, a regular news story nut graph, but I want people to know, here's what I think. I want to be clear about that. And that's kind of the hardest part. You can dance around some opinion, but forcing yourself to say it plainly is hard. It's really hard. It's the hardest part of writing. And so I try to, figure out and crystallize, what is my point? A point isn't always an opinion, like yay or nay. A point is, this is what it means, or, here's a way to think about this. Yeah, I would say read a lot of critics and, try to figure out what you really believe.
And regarding that question of reading critics, what is the state now for critics? You started by talking about the relative paucity of full-time architecture critics in the United States, and our other guests have noted that as well. So one question then is, how do we as a society continue to sustain and even increase the amount of criticism of the built environment and of this shared realm?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, will the existing business model in print journalism work, or do we have to adopt new models?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to adopt new models. When I said I was part of what, I think of as the third generation, I really worry about whether there's going to be a fourth generation, because local news is in a, really desperate straits right now. The Inquirer, I think the Inquirer's situation is the model for the future. After like a long soap opera in which we were bought and sold by different entities, we had the good fortune to be bought by a very wealthy philanthropist, Jerry Lenfest, who then created an institute, a nonprofit institute, and gave the newspaper to that institute. We're now a public benefit corporation. We can't lose money, but we don't have to pay shareholders. And so that's given us a lot of freedom and flexibility, and the Institute can receive grant money. That project I mentioned for the future of work got a very substantial grant from a foundation. We still have the independence and no one's telling us what to write, but that's kind of a new business model. I've been also working on a project to kind of seed new architecture critics around the country. I need someone to give me some money, but I have some nonprofits that are very eager to, fund positions on local newspapers. And I'm not talking about the usual suspects, because I think, we need critics in Boise and Newark, New Jersey, and places that have never had architecture critics, because our cities and towns are going to undergo radical changes, in the coming years, partly as a result of the pandemic.
Interesting.
So wanted to ask a question that has come from our audience. This is from Diana Vasquez. She says, hi, Inga, thank you so much for being here. Is there any hope for cities that are mainly accessible by car to become more public transit friendly? How can people be motivated to use public transit when public transit is less efficient than individual transportation?
Yeah, that's really hard. And I don't think it could just happen. I think we need federal policies to encourage transit use. It may never happen in, certain car-oriented cities, but we have seen quite a number of cities like Salt Lake has installed like trolley lines, streetcars. Phoenix, I was on one in Phoenix that went to the airport. We can start small. And the thing about them is, if a town or city builds a light rail with stations, you almost immediately start seeing development around those nodes. It can progress pretty fast. So I think cities have to be strategic about where they locate these lines. They have to start small and build them incrementally. And I think we need, to strengthen our federal policies in that way.
And that's also, it's an interesting question too, when you think about the combination of policy that drives transit and development decisions. As you're also looking at the future of work, do you see any kind of major epochal changes? I mean, you already have written about things. Sorry, I accidentally hit my mute. But you've already written about things like smartphones and the shift to online retailers and how those are changing. Mm-hmm. But do you see any other kind of major epochal changes in our economy or technology that are going to shape cities going forward?
Yeah, well, this pandemic has really accelerated everything. And look at, here we are on Zoom from all over. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, when this is over, we'll go back to our offices, like 9/11 or the Great Recession. But, those things happen before the cloud, before Zoom. So I think there's going to be an incredible shift in downtown office districts. The people are not going to go into their offices every day as they did in the past. When we go back, it's going to be very different. Offices will be reconfigured. I think they're going to become more like sort of business retreat centers. You'll go for meetings, you'll go for training, you'll go for special projects, you'll go to get out of the house, but you won't go 5 days a week. And so ultimately, that might mean less office spaces in downtown, and then all the ancillary things, lunch places, stores that office workers patronize, they're going to shift. So I kind of expect cities to be feel like more bedroom communities, but with high rises. And I think some of these office towers will be converted to apartments. I will say the thing that does give me some hope, because I live pretty close to downtown Philadelphia, is, with everyone working at home, there are a lot of people on the street. The streets are packed with pedestrians, with dog walkers, with kids. It's actually kind of nice. I think we're going to have to really invest a lot of money in parks, because if you're at home all day at your computer, you want to get out. Our parks here are just packed. So we may have to think, a little differently about what we prioritize as, just where we are during the day changes.
Well, about that, so the city of Philadelphia has, as you said, reinvented itself over the last 20 years. In the next 20 years, is that trend going to continue given all of these, these pressures? Do you see this as a continual upward trend, or is there a plateau or even a decline that you see coming in the future?
Yeah. I wish I knew. I don't really know. I am worried because, for example, Philadelphia depends on a wage tax paid by everyone in the city, but suburban commuters pay a lot of that tax. And if they're not working downtown anymore, you know, the city loses that revenue. And you know, so how is it going to fund all these improvements in parks and public spaces? How is it going to maintain services and pave the streets and pick up the trash? And, you know, if services decline, are we going to see a repeat of the 70s? You know, when people felt driven out of cities by the fact that they were so dysfunctional. You know, that's a real concern. Again, we need Washington to help cities through this really difficult time. I mean, of course, suburbs might have some of the similar challenges with revenue collection, but so I do worry about that. But, you know, in my more optimistic moments, as I said, it's been very chill in Philadelphia. And, you know, it is really nice to step out of your door and, you know, see all these people in the streets. It's a pretty, you know, it's not as dense as New York, but it's dense, and there are always people around. And, you know, that's still an attraction. And we, you know, now that we have outdoor dining and, you know, we've closed a lot of streets to cars, so we can have this outdoor dining. That's been really pleasant. We closed one of the river roads so people could bike, so we could have this trail along the river. You know, I think there's still attractions for being in the city. And then, you know, for people of lesser means, housing's still affordable. There's still transit. We still have those basic advantages. So, you know, it's you know, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I knew, but I'm not sure how it's going to play out.
Inga, this has been really wonderful hosting you this evening. And before we let you go, can you tell us about what you're writing about now?
So I just finished this future of work piece, and now I'm getting back to writing, you know, something under the architecture criticism rubric. And I'm working on a piece, actually a really interesting piece about our transit agencies building a new very big bus station, a transfer station, where, you know, like 10 bus lines come through this area. And the reason for building the transfer station is because we have so many people in poorer neighborhoods that commute to jobs in the suburbs, and they have to change buses 2 or 3 times. And this having a modern transfer station will enable them to get off one bus and get on another much faster and cut the, you know, their commute times. So it's really kind of an equity story, but there's another layer to this story as well. And that's the location for the transfer station is at this beautiful juncture between 2 rivers, the Schuylkill River and the Wissahickon Creek. And it's a, you know, kind of a very natural setting, and the bus station will be enormous. And our transit agency doesn't have a good history of, or a good record on design. So, you know, how do we get this social equity component, and how do we get good design? I guess this is what all my stories are about. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
That's great. I'll be, is that going to be on the Inquirer website? Is that going to be accessible there? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I hope by next week.
Next week. Great.
Yeah.
I'll definitely be looking for it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So thank you for being our guest tonight. Just as we go out, this is our next week will be our last and final week when we're going to welcome our final guest again, former Miami Herald architecture critic, Alistair Gordon. So thank you, Inga, for an enlightening conversation, and hope to see everybody next week.
Thank you.